Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the annual Black History Month lecture. Before I introduce Professor Judy Giesberg, who's going to introduce our speakers, I wanted to turn your attention to two things in preparation for our next event. I'm just so happy to see you, so I have to tell you about what's coming up next. One is I would love for you to, if you haven't already, pick up the Africana Studies brochure, which gives you information about the program. And also, we have all kinds of great posters and announcements about our events on the website, and the web address is on the back of the brochure. Also, we have our very lovely oversized postcard announcing our next event, which is going to be on Monday, March 14th. And we are delighted that we're going to have an evening with actress, playwright, professor Anna DeVere Smith. And so I've got a bunch of these also, which I will leave in the back. So I would love it if you would take some and if you would spread them around. I'm delighted that our speakers are with us today. And I'm going to turn it over. Daniel Biddle and Murray Dubin are coming at the recommendation of my history colleague, Dr. Judy Giesberg, who became friends with them when she was working on her latest book, Army at Home, Women in the Civil War on the Northern Home Front, which was published in 2009. I thought I would give her that plug because it was so kind of her to recommend them. And this was, by all accounts, I was saying to our speakers, they have been everywhere talking about this book, and I think we're going to be in for an absolute treat. So I want to introduce Professor Giesberg, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you all for coming, and especially to Murray and to Dan for coming and for your friendship and all the advice and hints that we get to share in research. 150 years ago yesterday, President-elect Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of Independence Hall as some 30,000 curious Philadelphians looked on. In his speech, Lincoln gave an early indication of an idea that would soon come to define his approach to solving the problem of slavery, one that would shape his presidency. That is, as the nation's founding document, the Declaration of Independence linked the fate of the nation to the realization of liberty. It was not, this is a quote from Lincoln, it was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, Lincoln explained, but something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weight should be lifted from the shoulders of all men and that all men should have an equal chance. He probably delivered it much better than I just did. It is altogether fitting that we have invited our two speakers here today to talk on a topic that Philadelphians were talking about 150 years ago today. As most of you know, Lincoln traveled a long and indirect road from this speech at Independence Hall, in which he spoke eloquently of a nation committed to the ideal that all should have an equal chance to emancipation. Many in the audience that day, on the other hand, had been actively making emancipation a foregone conclusion as they sheltered fugitives escaping the South and began pushing Lincoln to emancipate even before he was inaugurated. We don't know if Octavius Caddo was there that day, but Lincoln's words captured the mood of his generation of black activists. These were young men who grew up on the shoulders of giants, such as William Still, Robert Purvis, James Forten, men who had been waging a war against slavery since the beginning and who would raise sons and daughters who would fight for civil rights in the dark days of the post-Civil War era. Caddo and his friends would be the first black Philadelphians to taste freedom, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois. And the book that Dan Biddle and Murray Dubin have written is a fitting tribute to that fight. I'd like to introduce you to them now. Dan Biddle, who's here immediately to my right, is a writer and an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Dan won a Pulitzer Prize in 1987 for his investigative reporting on the problems with the city's criminal courts. And thanks to him, they were fixed, right? Is that right? Dan has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and has also taught at the University of Pennsylvania. Murray Dubin, also a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, now retired after 34 years, working for the paper in all sorts of capacities, in every capacity, even as fashion editor, is that right?
That's true.
At some point in time?
Shocking.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. So there's something else, that one of his other many skills that he can offer us. Is also the author of South Philadelphia, Mummers, Memories, and the Melrose Diner. The book they wrote together, which took them 7 years to write, in what was really a meeting of the minds and a creative fellowship, is Tasting Freedom, Octavius, Caddo, and the Battle for Equality in Civil War America. It's published with Temple University Press, and it's on sale here today in the back. Dan and Murray will be on hand after the talk today to sign copies of it. And I have to say, if you read one book this first year of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, okay, maybe two, this should definitely be one of them. It's a great read, and you're in for a great talk. So thank you for coming, and please join me in welcoming Dan and Murray.
Crystal, thank you very much for inviting us. Judy, thank you for the introduction. Not many people knew I was fashion editor. I don't tell a lot of folks about that. It shows the weakness of the paper. The reason this book took us 7 years is that we're slow. And there was a great deal that, quite frankly, we didn't know. This is a book about a rather obscure civil rights leader from the 1800s named Octavius Catto, and equally as obscure civil rights movement that he was part of. The first thing that Dan and I wrote in 2003, and which has since been rewritten about 15 times, is the preface to the book. It's not very long, and I'd like to read it. It's called October 10th, 1871. The young white man had the number 27 tattooed on his hand and a bandage around his head when he began shooting at a colored man named John Fawcett. He missed. Fawcett, a hod carrier from the Philadelphia neighborhood of Frankfurt, ran up South Street to escape. Joined by a crowd, the bandaged man chased him. Fawcett saw a cellar door in front of a store in the middle of the block. Before he could dive in, a white boy stuck out a foot and tripped him. Fawcett scrambled to his feet, and the bandaged man fired again. That same afternoon, about a mile away, another Negro, a schoolteacher with the Roman-sounding name of Octavius Valentine Caddo, left a pawn shop on 3rd Street and began walking home. People on the street knew who he was. An orator who had shared stages with Frederick Douglass, a second baseman on the city's best black baseball team, a teacher at a black school of national renown, and an activist who had fought in the state capitol and on the streets for equal rights. He was 32. It was Election Day 1871. In the busy South Street area, the institutional and emotional heart of the black community had been rocked by violence since the night before. Was it all the squire's doing? White policemen and Democrats who answered to him were attacking black voters, and scores had gone to the hospital. Caddo had sent his pupils home early. Rather than going directly to his boarding house, he chose a safer route, up Lombard to 9th Street near his fiancee's home, and then down to South Street. He lived at 814. Caddo walked with an assured athletic gait, as if his right to the pavement were guaranteed, which it was, but only lately. Memories of slavery haunted every colored home. Generations of men and women had risked their lives to claim the simplest of rights, to learn in a schoolhouse, serve in the army, ride the railways, cast a ballot. Now those rights were being tested. Caddo turned onto South Street at the moment when, in W.E.B. Du Bois's words, Americans of color were first tasting freedom. As Caddo walked east on South Street, the bandaged man was looking for more Negroes to hurt. More Negroes would not be able to vote that day. He passed Caddo nonchalantly, but once he was 5 steps beyond, the bandaged man turned and crouched. A young girl at 822 South shouted to Caddo, "Look out for that man!" The bandaged man was pulling out his gun. We get a lot of questions, Dan and I, but one question that every audience asks is, why'd you guys write this book? Not articulated in that question, but the real question is, why did you two white guys write this book about this black guy no one ever heard of who lived in the 1800s and who was involved in the civil rights movement in the 1800s that no one ever heard of either? It's a fair question, and quite frankly, it's an easy answer. Dan and I are newspaper guys, and though Dan looks very young, we actually have about 70 years of newspaper experience between us. Newspaper guys, this isn't better or worse, but our minds work differently. I walk around my own life, and whatever I see, my response is that a story? How do I do that story? Who should I talk to about that story? It actually makes my wife crazy. In the 90s, 1993, 1994, I was working on the South Philly book. I was at the Library Company of Philadelphia, 13th and Locust, and a wonderful librarian archivist there suggested I read an academic article about a guy I'd never heard of named Octavius Valentine Caddo. I did, and I was blown away by this article. And I was a little embarrassed because I couldn't understand why I'd never heard of him before. I couldn't understand why I hadn't learned about him in school. I'm from South Philadelphia. I didn't know what to do about it. But I made sure that Caddo, there was a little bit of him in my South Philly book. There were perhaps 5 or 6 paragraphs. But he was worth more than that. And for the next few years, whenever I had spare time, I tried to collect what I call string on Caddo, more information, to figure out sort of what to do with him. Unbeknownst to me, while I was being fascinated by Caddo, so was Dan. Dan was in a fiction writing workshop and didn't have anything to write a fictional story about, and was looking for a subject. He heard a radio interview with a very skilled writer and historian named Roger Lane, who just retired from teaching at Haverford. And Roger Lane had written a book about Black Philadelphia in the 19th century, and he talked a little bit about Caddo on the radio, just less than a minute. Dan was fascinated, thought, I have to write something about Caddo, and he wrote a short story about Caddo. Not knowing much, but he wrote a short story about Caddo, and he too was fascinated by his life. Sometime in the early 2000s, we actually don't know when, we've tried to figure this out and we can't, but let's say it's 2001. We're in the newsroom of the Inquirer together, and Dan, who's a Pulitzer winner, says something to me like, "What you doing?" And I told him that I was obsessed by this obscure guy he's never heard of. And he said, "Who?" And I said, "Octavius Caddo." And Dan said, "So am I." And I looked at him like he was crazy. We realized we had this mutual fascination with Caddo. But what were we going to do? Were we going to fight? And each of us tried to write a book about Caddo. The world could not support 2 books on Caddo. So we decided instead to shake hands and write a book together.
Lucky for us, right around that time, Google was just coming into its own, and we've often joked since then that Google, especially Google Advanced Search and Google Book, could be the third byline on this book. Around then, at the end of my workday at the Inquirer, I took to running Caddo's name through Google every which way. Not being real historians, we had to learn the hard way that in the 19th century no one spelled well. So I ran Caddo with 1 T, Caddo with 2 T's, Caddo with just the initials, Caddo with that full, gorgeous name of his, Octavius Valentine Caddo. His father's name, William Thomas Caddo, or sometimes W.T. Caddo. And one night I landed on one of these ancestry type sites where you can try to look up your family tree. or put a note reaching out to others asking for information. A man in Virginia had posted such a note. Leonard Smith was his name. I've often thought about how hard it would have been to find a man named Smith if it weren't for the internet. But Leonard's note said he was looking for any information anyone out there might have on his great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Catto, or William's son, Octavius. And I thought, here's our chance. And I sent Leonard an email asking if he'd be willing to share his phone number with me, and he did. And the next night, these two strangers, this black hospital administrator in Northern Virginia, in Alexandria, Leonard Smith, and me, a white newspaper editor up in Philadelphia, we'd never met before, got into a phone conversation. Leonard said that he had always been intrigued with the life of this ancestor of his, Octavius Caddo, and that Leonard's grandmother, who had only passed away a few years earlier in her 90s, had always told him about this very little known but heroic ancestor, had said, for example, whenever Rosa Parks' name had come up in conversation, you know, Rosa Parks wasn't the first one to sit down. Your great-great-uncle was. So we have this conversation, and frankly, it was one of the most exciting phone calls I've ever made. Leonard shared with me everything he knew off the top of his head from sort of the Caddo family lore. And he said, I'll be happy to help you guys with this book project any way that I can. I, too, am fascinated with the life of Octavius Caddo. All I ask is that you have Denzel play him in the movie. Well, that was back when Denzel was young enough to play him in the movie. And you know, our research, as you've already heard, took us roughly 7 years of research and writing. And if it hadn't been for wonderful help from people like Judy Giesberg, it probably would have taken 10. And one other thing that Leonard said to us right when we first met him, we went down there and had lunch with him at a Thai restaurant. And in addition to laying out for us what he knew and who he thought we could call upon, what other Caddo family members might be a help to us, he said, bear in mind, there were 100 OV Caddos. And I thought he was being humble, since he was talking about his own ancestor. The truth of those words grew on us with each week and month of research that we did, to the point where now the title of the introduction in our book is 100 OV Caddos. There were these men and women of color and a handful of strong white allies, but only a handful, who fought the same battles that Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson and the other courageous men of the modern civil rights movement fought. But this earlier generation fought them 80, 90, and 100 years earlier, and braved all sorts of perils. In the streets of Philadelphia in 1870, there was a voting rights march akin to the march from Birmingham to Selma. And like that later march, this march through Philadelphia in the spring of 1870 featured howling white mobs and unsympathetic white policemen, and stones being thrown, and epithets shouted, and shots being fired. And I was a history major in college at the University of Michigan, and before Murray and I went down this crazy road of trying to discover this earlier movement, I didn't know there had been one. I thought I knew something about abolition and slavery and equal rights and Reconstruction and the Civil War and emancipation, and I had no idea there had been this whole vibrant, well-connected movement with allies in the British Isles and Europe and Africa and the Caribbean, a movement that included poets and painters and hod carriers and domestic servants and fugitives from slavery. There was one bank clerk, there were novelists, there were teachers and ministers like Catto and his father. And they engaged in these acts of civil disobedience and organizing and petitioning and protesting. And like the marchers that we know better of Selma and Birmingham, they had their heads bloodied and their bones broken and their schools destroyed and their churches burned. And yet they went back for more. And they won some victories. And yet, with the exception of a handful of terrific historians and a few descendants, most modern Americans have never heard of their struggle or their bravery. And with this book here, Murray and I intend to change that.
The book we've written is very much about the North. It's about Cincinnati and Detroit and Boston and Brooklyn and Trenton and, of course, Philadelphia. But it starts in the South. The first couple of chapters are really set in Charleston. That's where the Catto family is from. And what I thought I knew about life in the South in the 19th century just was incomplete. In addition to white men who owned slaves, and black men who were slaves, there also were black men who were free and black men who owned slaves. William Caddo was a black man who was free, who did not own slaves. He was Octavius Catto's father. And he was, for his time, a very successful man. While cotton gets all the publicity in 19th century America, rice is also a very big crop in the South. William Catto is a millwright. He maintains the mill. He's a very important man, respected by all. But he wants to be more than a millwright, and this is incredible in the time, gets enough training to become a minister. And there are very few black ministers in the South in the 19th century. He actually wants to go overseas to Africa and preach the word of God in Liberia. To make a long story a little shorter, he doesn't get to Liberia and winds up in Philadelphia in the 1840s, late 1840s. The city that he left, Charleston, did not allow William Caddo and his children to be educated. The city that he left, in fact the state that he left in 1835, passed a law criminalizing education. Now think about this. If you taught a black man or a black woman or a black child to read in South Carolina after the law was passed, you could be fined if you were a white person. If you were a black person, you could be whipped. Nonetheless, William Caddo somehow got an education for himself and clearly got a rudimentary education for his children. But when he came north, he certainly wanted that education to be as positive and as wonderful as it possibly could be. So William Caddo, with other black men and women, helped start a school. It's called the Institute for Colored Youth. And its building, which was at 9th and Bainbridge in Philadelphia, is still there. You can actually go and see the building. It was an experiment in education because it was a black school with black teachers and a black principal, but it was owned by white Quakers. Now that doesn't sound so terribly experimental, but in the 1840s it certainly was. There was nothing like it. And the school wasn't just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. They taught Greek, taught Latin, taught trigonometry. It was an extraordinary school. I went to Central High School, which was also around in the 1830s, and was an academic, wonderful school then. And quite frankly, it's very possible that the Institute for Colored Youth, which we refer to as the ICY, was better. That school becomes a drawing point for black students all over the city and all over the region. Their parents want them to get an education, and it becomes crowded very, very quickly. It becomes a source of pride very, very quickly. And it showed both whites and blacks that black students in the North, in Philadelphia at the ICY, could do every bit as good as white students.
One of the many things that we wish we could know more about is what was going through William Catto's head by late 1848 when he gets his family up to the free North. We know it was an exciting time. We know he'd gone from this capital of slavery down in Charleston into kind of the lap of this rising civil rights movement in the North, where he began leading anti-slavery meetings with men whose names you may have heard of, Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett, who historians rate as Douglass's equal in that movement, Robert Purvis, Charles Remond from Massachusetts. We weren't able to find a William Catto diary, and there's not much that we were able to find in the way of his letters or sermons or writings. But we got enough that we tried to speculate a little bit about what might be going through the head of this young black minister, having come out of that place where learning for his people was a crime, into a city where learning was possible, and into the lap of this dangerous, exciting movement. He exhorted other black ministers to steer the brightest children to Oberlin and the few other colleges that, quote, open their doors to all classes without distinction or favor, unquote. That was a 19th century way of saying that Oberlin was one of the few schools that accepted people of color. And therein was heard the roar of William Catto's other inner engine. It was so powerful as to be his personal law of physics. Every action of the authorities of South Carolina and the United States of America to bar him and his people from the subversive acts of reading, writing, teaching, and learning would cause in William Catto an equal and opposite reaction in the upbringing of his son. Octavius would attend the best schools available to a free Negro boy, and since such schooling was limited at best, his father would track down tutors, petition school committees, and inveigle white men of influence to let his son join their academies. The same persuasive powers that had won him an endorsement and a geography book from Margaret Smith, as a powerful white woman in Charleston, and a semester at the feet of the Presbyterian divines, would from this day forward be applied on behalf of his son. A caring father, then. But that is not a complete picture. There's no evidence that William Caddo went to such lengths for any of his other children. It was more as though he were a gambler who had looked around the family table and made a cold calculation. Being Negro boys and girls in 1848, his children were fated to be waiters or drivers or domestics, and to go to their graves, as his friend Charles Remond had said, unwept by other Americans, uncared for, unprayed for. So Caddo placed his entire bet on his most promising child, the one most persuasive and well-spoken, most curious and unafraid, the one most like himself. Now we're going to go forward a little bit. As Judy mentioned, we're right on the anniversary now, the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. And something that fascinated Murray and me in learning about Octavius Catto's generation and his father's, but especially the young people. Caddo, by 1859, is all of 20 years old. In fact, his birthday was yesterday, February 22nd. The men and women around him are just getting to adulthood. They're 17 and 18 and 19. And when you read the words of their petitions and writings and speeches from that era, it reminds us baby boomers of the 1960s, because in those words, you can see that that generation thought they could change the world. And of course, they couldn't see what was coming. 1861 rolls around, and the world is splitting open right under their feet. The Civil War is about to begin. And in 3 years, Lincoln is going to make this strategic step, a step based mostly, if not entirely, on wanting the North to win the war, of emancipating slaves. But nobody could see that that would happen when the war began. When the war began, it was more about reunifying the country and had little to do with any commitment from the government to even consider ending slavery. But it sent this electric pulse through that early civil rights movement of blacks and whites. And by the middle of the war, by 1863, after Lincoln signs the Emancipation, the war is being lost. And the Northern government is increasingly desperate for a way to win. And a decision is made to let men of color into the Union armies. And another thing you see in all the writings and speeches of that early civil rights movement is an excitement that an opportunity has just opened up. Men like Frederick Douglass begin using the words now or never, that this is the opportunity to establish that a whole race of people are entitled to full rights as citizens. What better way to do it than to show valor on the battlefield? Anybody ever see the film Glory, in which there really is Denzel Washington? Pretty nice movie, and really expanded a lot of Americans' awareness of what black life was like in the United States in the middle of the Civil War. But that whole drive to get men of color to enlist in the Union armies, that was a political movement. That was Douglass and Caddo and the principal of the Institute for Colored Youth, Ebenezer Bassett, and others like them in a whole bunch of northern cities, trying to rally around this opportunity and get that door open and keep it open. And even though the 54th Massachusetts, the famous black unit that was organized up in New England, is better known as being from that part of the country, it wasn't just from there. This passage is from March of 1863. Anybody ever had the pleasure of attending a prayer service at Mother Bethel AME Church at 6th and Lombard in Philadelphia? Almost no one else. Great. Well, go there sometime and think about what happened there on this March night in 1863. All right, on the wrong page, stand by. The governor of Massachusetts had begun the North's first all-Negro military unit, the 54th Massachusetts. But there were so few Negroes in that state that his call became nationwide. Frederick Douglass, whose son had volunteered for the 54th, urged an audience of several thousand at Mother Bethel in Philadelphia. Quote, "Get an eagle on your button and a musket on your shoulder by the speediest means, at any cost. And when you have Uncle Sam's uniform on your back, all the devils in Jeff Davis's dominions cannot keep you out of citizenship. The whole heavens are written over with now or never for the colored people." Then Douglass began to sing. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. Douglass had learned to sing in boyhood, when a master had made him lead other slaves in hymns. He had later sung anti-slavery songs for allies in Britain. Now he sang to the rafters of a house of worship that he had once derided for its shuddering fear of anti-slavery meetings. Now he sang to persuade young colored men of Philadelphia not to protest or petition, but to enlist for Uncle Sam. By the second stanza, the whole audience was singing. 5 men volunteered on the spot. "Halloo out your names," Douglass commanded, and one by one, 5 cheers went up. In the end, so many heeded his call that one company of the 54th was all Philadelphian.
The only reason Dan reads that is he likes to sing. He never lets me read that. As you know, the Civil War took 4 years. The battle to end the segregation of Philadelphia streetcars took 8 years. Beginning in 1859, there were streetcars drawn by horses crisscrossing the city. There were 19 of them in a year or so. There's no SEPTA, no city agency, 19 companies running streetcars. Those companies decided in their wisdom that those streetcars should be for whites only. Occasionally they would let a black rider stand in the front with the conductor in an unprotected area with whatever's on the street sort of coming up and hitting you in the face. The war begins. There are Union soldiers in uniform of color. They can't ride on the streetcars. Their mothers and sisters and brothers visiting them in the hospital. They can't ride on the streetcars. After the war, in 1866, an organization that was national but had a Pennsylvania chapter called the Equal Rights League formed a committee to somehow stop this. Caddo was one of 3 people on the committee, and Catto somehow had the political intelligence to fight this streetcar battle on 2 fronts. One front was in Harrisburg. The streetcar committee went to Harrisburg and lobbied white legislators, there are no black legislators, to enact a law that would make segregation illegal. What's incredible about that is in 1866, black men in Pennsylvania do not have the vote. So they have no power, none whatsoever. There's no reason for anyone to listen to them. But they're listened to. And they, in fact, write drafts of the law and lobby intensively in Harrisburg to get that law passed. The other prong of the fight is on the streets. And again, this is years and years before any streetcar, buses, battles anywhere in Birmingham or Selma or anywhere else in the South. But Caddo organizes civil disobedience. He gets black pregnant women on the streetcars en masse. Lincoln College students on the streetcars en masse. Black clergymen en masse. And they go in such great numbers that the conductors can't throw them off. If the conductors try, the black protesters leave, and there's usually awful publicity for the streetcar companies. Finally, in late 1866, Caddo and his committee convince a legislator from Erie, whose name is Morrow Lowry, and he introduces a bill, and the bill actually passes. In 1867, the governor signs it, and the streetcars, not just in the city, but in the state, are desegregated. Segregation is no longer legal. Saturday's Philadelphia Press reported that Republican Governor John W. Geary signed the bill on Friday, March 22. All that remained was to test the law on the streets. This was no routine matter. Men as old as Purvis and Whipper remember when the state laws had granted them the vote but gave no shield against white men's blows at the poll. Someone respectable should test the law. Being a minister or a teacher was better than a washerwoman or a maid, but better a woman than a man. Someone to stand straight in a rain of words or blows. On the first Monday of spring, young women in Philadelphia were trying the new styles. Straw bonnets, chintzes, plaid silks from India, and the new hoop skirts, only 3 yards round, and more flexible, suited to modern times, to sitting at a teacher's desk or riding a crowded car. Under a cloudless noontime sky, the Ohio School's young principal and her assistant walked to 11th and Lombard Streets, where the 10th and 11th Street railways ran. The assistant was Alice Gordon, and she stood by as the principal flagged down the car. Carrie LeCount caught the attention of the conductor. His name was Edwin F. Thompson, and he looked right back at LeCount. He sneered at her, as one newspaper put it, and kept the car moving. He uttered the same words heard by the war hero, the poet, the colored soldiers, and the loved ones, the minister with his ailing boy. We don't allow niggers to ride. Just a month past her 21st birthday, LeCount was prepared. She promptly filed a complaint. In court, she held up a copy of the press with the news that the governor had signed the law. I know nothing of a new law, the magistrate said, and I don't trust that newspaper. LeCount went to a state office and returned to the magistrate with a certified copy of the law. Thompson, the conductor, and his company paid a $100 fine.
So you get this brave generation coming up in this exciting time where rights are expanding and it seems possible that the world can change. About the most famous speech that Caddo ever gave was a commencement speech at the ICY in 1864. And by that time, emancipation was the law of the land, and federal troops were occupying whole swaths of the slave South. And freed people were, for the first time, in a position to get a legal education. And in that speech that was only supposed to be a commencement address, where Caddo went over who had gotten the best grades in math and physics and languages, and how the school had expanded and the library was in good shape and students were doing well, he also did this unusual thing of turning the audience in a different direction and calling upon students coming out of that school, the ICY, to go south, almost like a modern Peace Corps. I want to mention that because this year is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Peace Corps. Anybody here ever serve in the Peace Corps or interested in serving overseas in the Peace Corps? A couple hands. Anyone interested in teaching in dangerous, faraway places? A show of hands. Well, Catto exhorted this generation of young black students in 1864 to go south and essentially to right the wrong that he and his family and millions of others had seen in the South, where education was unlawful for people of color. And all over the North, in the few black schools that existed then, graduates were starting to come out of those schools and go south and take the chance of going into this territory where the people in charge, by and large, were still people who had only recently been slave owners or supporters of a slave system, and take a chance that the presence of federal occupying armies down there would make it a safe enough place that you could open a classroom and teach, not only teach children, but teach adults, teach freed people who all through their lives, even into adulthood and even into old age, had never had an opportunity to learn. And something that fascinated us was that, for one thing, the ICY, this little black school in Philadelphia, conducting this outrageous experiment for those days of having black teachers teach black students, not only created this whole generation of top-notch scholars, but sent more teachers into the newly liberated South to teach the freed people than any other educational institution in America. And some of the young teachers that went south left some records. One of the young graduates that Caddo even mentioned in his speech was a girl named Sally Gaffin, who came from Philadelphia. She was a light-skinned person of color, a mulatto, as people said in those days. As black society went in 1860s Philadelphia, Sally Gaffin was from a fairly well-off family and had a decent life in Philadelphia, but now she was squaring her shoulders and heading south. And she was not alone, but these were some remote places that these young black teachers were going in the American South. A north-south grapevine of educators, churches, and charities kept the teachers supplied. Harrisburg's chapter of the Equal Rights League, known as the Garnett League, raised money to put up a building, part church, part schoolhouse, for freedmen in Clinton, Tennessee. The new teacher there was Sally L. Gaffin, ICY, class of 1860. Gaffin, by then, had already taught in Norfolk, Virginia, and she was, in Catto's words, quote, the pioneer in our ranks, unquote. Soon after she started at the Tennessee school, visitors reported, quote, bright, attentive faces and perfect order. The pupils were young and old. A few of them were elderly. Quote, though deprived of the benefits of education while young, they do not think it too late, even at the 11th hour, to endeavor to make up as far as possible for lost time. So she's teaching these classrooms where the youngest pupils might be 7 or 8 years old, and the oldest are men and women in their 70s and 80s. Some white Tennesseans could not stomach this sight. As President Andrew Johnson often pointed out, many white Tennesseans, that was his native state, had never owned a slave. They had survived hard childhoods and poor schools. Now, they saw former slaves lining up for lessons from well-attired northern mulattoes in schools built with northern money, using textbooks donated by northern children. A report to the Tennessee legislature warned of, quote, an eternal hatred, unquote, directed against persons engaged in giving instruction to the humbler class of their fellow men. The report was on a new organization, the Ku Klux Klan. A message went back up the grapevine. Gaffin School needed Christmas presents. Pupils in Massachusetts filled a box and shipped it. The holiday was long gone when the box arrived. But Gaffin did what teachers do. She improvised. The school in Clinton, Tennessee would celebrate Christmas in April. Townspeople of both races became caught up in this project. Men cut down a cedar tree and propped it up in Gaffin's little schoolhouse. By the time the children surged in, quote, the presents were conspicuously displayed on its boughs to the great delight of the youngsters, to most of whom this was their first sight ever of a Christmas tree. Young northern teachers at the freedmen schools in the South typically stayed 2 years before resuming their easier, safer lives back home. The parents of Clinton, Tennessee wrote to Sally Gaffin, saluting her, quote, untiring efforts in diffusing education among not only our children, but among persons of adult age. They begged her to teach in Clinton for another year. Gaffin had stopped noticing how much darker and less refined her Clinton pupils were than her peers back in Philadelphia at the ICY. At times, she used first-person plural, and we saw this over and over in the writings of these young teachers. She wrote as if she and her students were allied in some larger purpose. Quote, and these are her words, I feel that I cannot do too much nor work too constantly for the elevation of my race and for the banishment of those prejudices which have so long formed a barrier to our rise, unquote. She agreed to return to the Clinton School in the fall of 1868. I'm going to end on a sad note. As exciting as that was when those young teachers went south and took their chances teaching in these places where millions of people of color had been barred from the schoolhouse until then, it drew out a hatred and an anger in many whites down there that the extent of it is hard to fathom. There are many really well done scholarly accounts of what happened next. The Ku Klux Klan was on the rise. White mobs took to burning down black schoolhouses in the South. One of the other people in our story, a black organizer who worked at Catto's site in Philadelphia, John Oliver, had his schoolhouse in Virginia burned. J.W. Cromwell, who had been a student in the audience when Caddo gave his 1864 speech, exhorting graduates of the ICY to go south and teach. Cromwell's little schoolhouse in Spanish Neck, Maryland, was burned, and one night Cromwell barely survived when white riflemen came after him on his way out of that school building and chased him into the woods, firing their rifles at him. Was nearly, well, I'll start that sentence again. Among the schools that were burned were nearly every colored church and schoolhouse in the neighborhood of Tuskegee, Alabama, in the fall of 1870. And in Monroe County, Mississippi, where the Klan was on the upsurge, white mobs burned down 26 schools for freedmen in the space of 5 months. Another school that burned was Sally Daffin's in Clinton, Tennessee. White men burned it down just days after the nation's new president had been sworn in. Gaffin would forever link those two events in her memory. Yes, she wrote bitterly, we brought it on ourselves. And she slipped again into her first person plural. On the Thursday before the fire, she wrote, quote, we, my students and I, hoisted the U.S. flag in honor of the inauguration. She had also written on the blackboard that day, 3 cheers for U.S. Grant, President of the United States. Well, we could go on with this. We love reading from this book and telling this story, and we are very grateful for Villanova for letting us do this. And for more of the readings, you'll have to buy the book, and in the meantime, we would love to field your questions. Questions.
Yes,
it's
sir.
always the...
Sorry, I might have missed this, but I'm just interested to know, like, in the very beginning, what got you thinking along the path of sort of, wanting to write about this era in history?
Well, I think as Murray was saying, was just we're both wired up in this strange way where the thing that really gets our motor going is if something you hear something or read something that sounds like a good story. And I mean, I've always been kind of interested in American history, and I think you have also, but it sounded like a heck of a story. And for reporters, it's an even better story when you find out that it has not been widely told. And you might be the first to be able to tell it. And it's even better if it's a story you think can make a difference. And this, rang our bells on all 3 of those fronts. I mean, a setback was that obviously most of the people in it, all the people in it, are long gone. We can't reach out and interview them as we would for a modern book or newspaper story. But we try not to let that stop us. And we did have the pleasure of interviewing one woman who, when we sat down and spoke with her, was 101, and who, in her teenage years, had been a good friend of Carolyn LeCount,
Who was
the
an old
black
woman
school
at the time.
principal who broke the color line on the street.
It was
car.
incredibly exciting.
She knew her by a nickname we'd never heard before. That was exciting. That made it feel like it was not 150 years ago.
What was the nickname?
Liney. Her name
Last
was
part of
Carolyn,
Caroline.
and her nickname was Liney. And when the 100-year-old woman who was 12, Carolyn LeCount was an older woman, probably
60, yeah.
in 60s or 70s, and a retired school teacher and school principal in Philadelphia, and an important person in the community. Yes, miss.
the fact that newspaper people are wired differently is really very apparent to us, especially. Last week we had Bob Woodward here.
Wow.
And he actually, with the whole Watergate incident, many of the things that you two have done with Octavius, he did with the people involved in the Watergate conspiracy. And he made a statement about Captain Graham when she took him to lunch, and she said to him, "So, will we ever have a story?" And he said, "Probably never." She said to him, "Don't ever say never to me again. There is never a never." And I really think that the audience felt, I know I did personally, what a wonderful gift you as reporters, investigators, whatever you want to call yourselves, what a wonderful gift you give us. And how great it is that you have reintroduced us to Octavius in such a way that these young students can understand that they are the next sort of bearers of finding the truth and digging as deep as they have to dig to get it. And I really commend the two of you
Thank
on
you.
that.
Thanks.
That's very kind of you.
Thanks, and thanks for putting us in the same sentence with Bob Woodward, too.
Other comments? Yes, Kristen.
Could you talk a minute, I have actually two questions, one's really quick. Your initial story about the guy with the bandaged head chasing a guy named Fawcett, was he by any chance Jesse, the writer Jesse Fawcett's relative?
I
do you
tried to pin that down. I don't know if this John Fawcett is related to that family, but it's certainly
think? One
possible.
might think.
Because
possible.
Redmond Fawcett, who was
Yes.
Jesse's father,
Yes, that's right.
was definitely a contemporary. He was a little bit older than Caddo and a little younger than Caddo's father, but they crossed paths many a time.
So probably a.
I'd love to
I mean,
think
I
so.
would
Yeah.
think.
I mean, an oddity
It's not
then
a-
was that names kept coming up spelled different ways. So,
Yeah.
so that Fawcett, Faucet, sometimes in the 1860s came up spelled like the hod carrier Fawcett, Fawcett. But I'd love to think there is that connection.
My question actually was about sources, your primary sources, and sort of where your, maybe, I guess I'm wondering where your research took you, what kinds of archives and what kinds of primary
Everywhere,
sources.
everywhere. I mean,
Including across the lobby here,
in this building, yeah. Yeah, there's a
the Black Abolitionist papers,
there's a collection of
Goldmine.
stories and articles about American history of, I guess, of people of color in the 1800s. And does it go into the early 19th?
No, I
I'm
think
not
it
sure.
kind of
Yeah.
ends around
And
1865.
it's voluminous, and it's only housed in 3 or 4 places in this area, and Villanova is one. We were in South Carolina. We were at the Library of Congress. We were all over Philadelphia, which is a gold mine. I mean, Philadelphia has, at the corner of 13th and Locust, almost everything you want to know about the nation in the Historical Society and the Library Company. Dan spent far too many hours at the Presbyterian Historical Society learning about William Caddo's religious history. And they have all those records from the
And they've got a
1800s.
few of his letters when he
Yeah.
was being groomed to go to Africa. And they're
The
hard to
Nation-
read, but
yeah.
they're, his
The
handwriting. and
National
everything.
Archives. We went to, where do we see the Caddo letter?
At the Wofford College, the United Methodist Collection in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
We actually found a letter that William Caddo wrote that was the actual letter. I mean, we held it in our hands. I mean, and we didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I mean,
And it was
just
a heck of a
marvelous.
letter. It was a letter in
It was an important letter.
1836.
It's sort of in the book.
Yeah, and had to do with a peculiar effort to integrate a Methodist church. Not so much to let both races sit together, but to allow the free, generally lighter-skinned people of color to sit downstairs with the whites instead of upstairs in the galleries with the darker enslaved people. And the letter was, I mean, it's all in here, but the letter is full of the resentment between those two groups of people. And real historians told us it's a heck of a ladder. I mean, it's painful. And it showed that there was this class division between free people of color and enslaved people that was very bitter, and it's full of expressions of how, as bad a deal as we get from white owner classes down here, we are hated even more by our, as some of the writings put it, our sable brethren, and it's quite something.
And the Methodist church community sort of discussed this at the highest Methodist levels.
Yeah, what do we do? Where do we
And
make
ultimately
people
did
sit?
nothing. Judy.
I wanted to know if you wanted to add anything in there about baseball. Fans who are thinking about.
Oh, we'd love to. It's spring training. There's a whole chapter about baseball in the book. And one of the reasons I think we both were particularly interested about Caddo is while he has many, many contemporaries and many people who did extraordinary things just like he did, he's really the only baseball player in the group. And he is a second baseman.
White and W.C. Bolivar and
Yes.
others.
Jake White, isn't he?
Yes, he is a baseball player.
Very
Well, he's the only good baseball player. He's the second baseman. He's the captain of a team, and make a very long story short, he really tries to integrate baseball in the 1860s, which is 80 years before Jackie Robinson. He officially fails, but it's the first try at crossing the color line in baseball. And in 1869, because he continues to try, he shames sort of fledgling Major League Baseball into setting up the first white-black baseball game. It's an exhibition game. It's right here in Philadelphia, and it's on the front page of the New York Times the next day saying this is the first game.
And who wins?
The
The
whites
white
win. The
team-
white team wins the first one, and then they meet again. What, 3-4 days later? And
Yeah, actually they play another white team shortly thereafter and beat them. And baseball isn't all that different than it is now, except they're not playing with gloves. They're playing barehanded.
so their hands got really scaly and clawy.
Yes.
I think it's interesting just the idea and the concept of having a civil rights era in the 1860s, and not in the South but in the North.
That's right.
A place with such rich history as like Philadelphia. So I was kind of curious about, this is like a off the wall type of question, but like because of the type of history that Philadelphia has, like a historical tour with the book and the events that happened in that time, and because I was just interested when you were saying that, if you go to the Methodist Church, consider what happened there, and just the different places in Center City that have this rich history that people just walk by every day.
It's true. It's a great idea. It's lucky us. There was a historian in town, Harry Silcox, who passed away a couple of years ago, but was a great help to us and he wrote the scholarly piece on Catto's political career that Murray was talking about. And it was really the first scholarly work focused on Catto's life. And as a fringe benefit, one night when we had dinner with Harry, he started talking about these sites, like where Mother Bethel was in relation to Catto's boarding house and where the bandage man had come up South Street. And he finally waves his arm and says, "Come on, I'll take you on a tour." And he took us on the kind of tour you're describing and just made it come to life. So that's, I like that idea.
Yeah. At one
A
point,
civil rights walking
at one
tour.
point, he knocked on the door of a closed bar.
This is so
It's
wonderful.
closed. And the guy says, "We're closed." And Harry says, "I don't care. You were the bar that 140 years ago. I got to show these guys." Guy let us in. We
Yeah.
toured the bar. It was great.
And sure enough, in there was a cash register from 1869, 2 years before our opening scene. So that, and Harry's, we really lucked out on this. We got to work with people like Judy and the great archivists down in South Carolina. Harry, how all these people came upon this story continues to fascinate me. Harry, by his own account, grew up in a bigoted household in Northeast Philadelphia. He was white. And he happened to go to Temple, and he's a very tall guy and a good basketball player, and was on some of Temple's great basketball teams of the 1950s. We asked him, how did you, Harry Silcox, happen to get interested in this obscure figure, Octavius Catto, and write the first scholarly work about him for your PhD? Well, Harry, after explaining how bigoted his own mom had been, describes going on this, going to this road game, this basketball game with his teammates. And it happened that Temple's team at that time had 1 or 2 black players. So the whole basketball team gets down to Norfolk or Richmond or wherever they were going, and they have to stop outside of town because the hotel they were going to stay at wasn't going to let in a black guest. And then Harry, I'll never forget this. I mean, this is him telling it a half century later. Sitting at this diner with Murray and me, makes a fist over the table and describes how at one restaurant where they stopped for lunch, whoever sat them down said, well, your teammate's going to have to eat in the kitchen. And Harry Silcox, at 74, a half century later, puts his fist out over the table and says, well, if he was going to eat in the kitchen, then we were going to eat in the kitchen. And that was Harry's moment of epiphany. The whole team, as an act of spontaneous civil disobedience, ate out back with their teammate. And those events set Harry on this course to learn about early black civil rights struggles and write his PhD on Caddo and give you and me something to start out with. So, I mean, and we could go on like that. The discoveries we've had of people and documents on this little
Yeah, people
tour
have been really kind
have
and
been
generous
quite exciting.
to us.
And we haven't even talked about the Dorsey scrapbooks.
Yes. But he will if you let him.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions from anybody? Yes, sir.
You began by contrasting the 1960s with the 1860s, and certainly some of the iconic leaders in the civil rights movement were Rosa Parks, the seamstress, etc. Did you find a consistency in terms of background and class among the leadership of the African American leaders in Philadelphia in the 1860s?
A great question.
That's a good question.
We probably didn't go as far down that road as we could have. The Pythian team, which included many of
That's
the
the baseball
same kind
team.
of civil rights allies that turned up in Caddo's political life. Was it Hirschberg at
Yes.
the Penn? Ted Hirschberg at Penn had his students do a whole study of the Pythians' socioeconomics. And they all came out pretty high up by the scale of economics for black Philadelphia in the 1860s. Minister sons like Catto, people who by those standards of those times had some money in their pockets. But that was not universally the movement. And I guess I've become fond of saying there were painters, there were novelists, there were hod carriers, there were maids, there were fugitives from slavery, because we found evidence of all of that. I mean, some of them certainly, probably if you could really analyze the leadership class of that movement, I think you'd find that they were overwhelmingly the better off class. But better
Absolutely.
off in context. How well off was Octavius Catto? Well enough to demand a good salary from the ICY, lucky enough to have come from a free family in the South, but he lived in a boarding house, and I mean, at one point in his life, he started spending a lot of money and bought a great outfit at Wanamaker's, and you can go to the Historical Society and look at the bill from
Yeah,
Wanamaker's,
and the-
but he happened to buy it about 2 weeks after that march where people were able to celebrate voting rights in the spring of 1870. And we like to think it wasn't just that he had a lot of money in his pocket, but he had a real reason to celebrate.
And Ebenezer Bassett, the principal of the ICY, which is really, really a high up there position in the community, was also its janitor. Because he
Right.
needed the extra money.
One thing that's interesting though is that when you were talking about, is it LeCount?
LeCount,
LeCount.
Carolyn LeCount.
Well, the way that you describe her being the appropriate choice is the same way that
Rosa Parks was
historians have
absolutely,
described.
absolutely.
have described,
Yes.
because they
And-
wanted somebody
and that's a very nice
respectable,
linkage.
Hold her head up.
who was
Yeah,
quiet,
that's a
respectable,
very nice linkage. You're
employed.
right.
You had to have the right test case.
And
it's
all
same
the,
kind of-
to the extent that we found any writings by or about her before that crucial moment, she was already known for her poise and ability to operate with an audience. And I mean, we just God help us, we love this stuff. She had the best grades on her final exams at the ICY of any kid who graduated her year, besting all the girls and all the boys, and the only other kids who came close were her sister and her brother.
Well, and it
Who
sounds,
better?
it
And
sounds the
also-
same as like Rosa Parks,
Right.
right?
Also-
Who had all of this background.
She was
in
a
civil rights
public speaker who read essays, who read poetry, and who did imitations in front of people. And supposedly she did a great Irish woman imitation. She supposedly was wonderful. Had a great Irish accent.
And she was also politically connected.
And-
Too.
and
I mean,
yes.
like you know, I mean,
Yes.
in that way that we sort of have told several stories of Parks, right? That she's just sort of happened into this
Right,
and
right.
was tired
Not
and
really
whatever,
kids,
and not at all, right?
Right.
And LeCount is the same.
Yes.
This wasn't an accident. This was
Yes.
It
And-
sounds like the Anna Devere Smith of her time.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Imitating Irish.
Yes, yes. No, and she was actually fairly famous for it. And later in life, when she's a principal, she's actually the spokesperson when some white Board of Education people cast aspersions on the qualities of black teachers. And she says, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy?"
And she
we
gives
do-
a ripping letter to the editor
just
about it.
wonderful. And she's far smarter than they are.
And some editorial writer points that out, says
Yes.
all these critics on the school board couldn't compete with Miss LeCount,
Right.
you know,
Well, no,
in
they
an
had to-
academic
they
contest
had
ever.
to get higher scores.
Right.
That's
Black
right.
teachers had to get
That's
higher
right.
scores
Yes.
than white teachers had to even be certified.
We could keep you here all,
Yeah.
Holly.
And we'll stay, we love doing this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Great question.